Hi, folks. You're really welcome today to this webinar on wetlands, which is celebrating World Wetlands Day. To begin, let's discuss what exactly is a wetland. Well, a wetland is an area of land that is saturated with water, either all of the time or through certain seasons, and where the water table is near or at the surface of the land. Wetlands may vary considerably in how they look, owing in part to where they occur and owing to what kind of plants are present there. There are special groups of plants that are adapted and designed to cope with wet conditions. And as these wet conditions vary from place to place, a mix of habitats made up of different plant communities and even pockets within a single wetland may contain different communities and groups of species. So wetlands are a great place for lots of different living things and water-specific plants and then animals to live. So they're really important for biodiversity. Can you name a few things that you think might be a wetland? That's great. Rivers, lakes, ponds, streams, maybe somebody said bogs. They're all really good examples of different types of wetlands. And we will discuss some of these and more later on. Ireland's wetland habitats range from very small, so for example, maybe a small freshwater spring, to habitats that are really obvious to see in the landscape, such as lakes, rivers, and bogs. These different wetland habitats are home to a large diversity of plants and animal species, and they form a very valuable network or series of different sites that are very important for different species. And many of them actually support animals that use them at different times of the year for migration. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on when we look at a case study in Wexford. One of the reasons why there's a good diversity of wetlands is because we have some freshwater areas inland. So that's just water that has come directly from the rain and either flown down mountains in streams and rivers, and it collects in different areas on the land away from the coast. And that water is typically fresh water. Then as we move down towards the coastal areas, some of that water may mix with the salt water coming in from the sea in estuaries or lagoons. And those places are typically filled with brackish water. That brackish water is that water, it's not fully salty, it's not as salty as the seawater, but it's part of the way there. It's just diluted by some fresh water running off the land. And just to say that some of the wetlands here are world renowned. So they're famous all around the world. All the scientists around the world that study wetlands would know about some of the Irish wetland features because they're really unique. They only happen here, or nearly only happen here, such as the turlough. And the amount of bogs we have is really high compared to most other countries. And then we have the Shannon Callows, which is kind of like the floodplains of the Shannon, which again are internationally known about. So scientists all over the world would know about these habitats. So here's kind of a pretty full list of all the different types of wetlands that we can have. And you probably mentioned some of these earlier when I asked the question. So we've lakes and reservoirs and ponds, turloughs, rivers and canals, swamps and marshes, floodplains, peatlands, wet woodlands, caves, cliffs, salt marshes, dune slacks, and wet macar, transitional waters, intertidal and subtidal habitats as well. So that's a really, really big list. And we won't have any time to get through all of them today, but we will look at a few of them and a few that are really important worldwide, but that we find here in Ireland. So we're going to have 5 examples that we're going to look at here in Ireland. But before we get to that, let's have a look at why wetlands are important. Well, overall, as I kind of mentioned already, wetlands are really important for biodiversity. But in addition to that, they help us with other things, such as water quality. They help to improve and maintain the water quality by removing and holding on to pollution and sediments. Wetlands also help to reduce the effect of storms and floods. So they naturally store some of that water or soak it up and release it slowly, a bit like a sponge. They also help to maintain the water table and to store the nutrients in floodplains, and this helps the production of crops and timber as well for us. So therefore, really obvious benefits or really strong benefits that wetlands provide, but they're not the only ones. We also know that wetlands are very important in preventing climate change or preventing climate change getting worse. This is because they act as a carbon store. They store carbon in the ground. Peatlands, bogs in particular, store 20 to 30% of the world's soil carbon. That is 3 times more than the amounts stored in tropical rainforests. So it's a huge amount. Also, over 2/3 of the world's fish harvest is linked to the health of coastal and inland wetland areas. So wetlands are so important for providing our food as fish to us. Wetlands also provide an aesthetic component. What that means is the beauty of their landscape and the enjoyment of their landscape is really, really important in our lives. They give us a sense of wilderness and open space and a place for recreation, such as hiking or fishing, boating or birdwatching. And finally, wetlands are an intrinsic part of our cultural heritage in Ireland. They provide material for traditional old buildings, and they also contribute to place names and folklore. So, for example, I have a few Irish place names that are linked to wetland names. So I'll give you one example. Dublin. The word Dublin actually comes from Dubh Linne, and that means black pool. Can you name any places that you think where the name comes from a reference to a wetland? A few more examples that I have are Owenbeg, that's a village and townland in County Sligo, and that comes from the Irish Owen Bheag, Little River. There's another place in County Monaghan called Sheskin, and it's a townland in the north of that county, and the name comes from the Irish word Sheskin, which means marsh or quagmire, and it refers to the significant area of blanket bog within the townland. Now, the biodiversity of wetlands in Ireland has been estimated to be worth 385 million per year to the Irish economy. So that means that wetlands are basically doing 385 million euros worth of work for us each year, whether that's cleaning the water or producing oxygen or supporting pollinators or other wildlife that we rely upon. It's also estimated that 330 million euros worth of ecotourism and nature value have been attributed to Irish landscapes and habitats. And part of that would also be attributed to wetlands. So we can see that wetlands are really important for many reasons across the board. Now, it's time to look at some examples of Ireland's wetlands, and I've picked 5 today. I've kind of tried to spread them across Ireland a little bit, but the main thing about each of these is that they are really well known across the world, not the actual sites per se, but the types of habitats are known to be really important in Ireland, and they contribute to that rich biodiversity, and they all have, I suppose, special importance across the world. So the first thing we're going to look at is a fen, and we'll look at one example of a fen. Then we'll look at raised bogs. Then we'll look at blanket bogs. Then we'll look at what a thurlock is, and I'll show you one example of one. And then finally, we'll look at a transitional water example. So let's start with fens. Has anyone here ever heard of a fen before? If so, is there one near your school? And what do you know about it? Fens began to develop about 10,000 years ago. That is a long time ago, just at the end of the last ice age. They started with a depression or a hollow in land that was filled with a shallow lake. The shallow lake would have had very little oxygen. And without oxygen, the plants that die cannot decompose or rot properly because there's not enough oxygen to keep the living things that help with decomposition, the living things that help things to break down and rot away. They can't live if there's no oxygen. So you don't have these little animals and other living things breaking down the dead plant material. So the dead plant material builds up and up and up. So in time, we start with a shallow lake that doesn't have much oxygen in it. And then in time, undecomposed plant material, so plant material that's not rotting, builds up and builds up and builds up towards the surface of the lake. And eventually will be so close to the surface that other plants will start to grow on it, such as sedges. They're like a type of grass. And this forms a fen. Fens tend to occur in limestone regions of Ireland, where the water supply is rich enough in minerals. And they occur throughout the country, most commonly in the West and the Midlands of Ireland. And this map shows the distribution of important fens in Ireland, some of the most important fens in Ireland. And this information, as you can see, comes from a 2017 database. If you look at all the little dots on the screen, you might notice that Mayo has a very high number. In fact, it has the highest number per county. Fens can be confused with marshes and swamps, but you can tell them apart by the types of plants that live there. In a rich fen, where there's lots of nutrients, you might find black bog rush, saw sedge, or other tall sedges. In a poor fen, you might just find tall rushes and flowering plants, or lower growing knee-high rushes and sedges. Normally, in a fen, it wouldn't be very acidic, so a little bit alkaline. So here's an example of a fen in Ireland.
Wetlands have a vital role in sustaining wildlife, providing flood control, mitigating against climate change, and a whole lot more besides. This is Pollardstown Fen in County Kildare. When the glaciers finally melted away some 10,000 years ago, huge amounts of sand and gravel washed out over the Curragh. Groundwater emerges from the edge of the Curragh in a line of springs. Over thousands of years, these springs have created Pollardstown Fen. It is always wet and alkaline, so the plants and animals that live here are specially adapted to this unique environment, including a beautiful little whorl snail, Vertigo gieri. As well as the very rare species that live here in the fen, there are lots of frogs and newts, as well as mammals such as pygmy shrews, otters, hares and foxes. Reeds are a habitat for buntings, meadow pipits and skylark. In autumn, pintail and tufted duck arrive to overwinter here.
Well, Pollardstown Fen is a real gem. You have reed buntings, louseworts, sundews, damselflies, dragonflies, and a whole host of wetland species. After there was some restoration works undertaken in the early 80s to undo some of the reclamation, there has been increasing numbers of waterbirds arriving every year which are benefiting from the re-wetting. Not only does Pollardstown Fen support Ireland's biodiversity, but also stores fresh water and regulates our carbon cycle.
Wetland sites across Ireland need protection, restoration and rehabilitation, not only for wildlife, but for climate, for water quality, for life.
Now, has anyone here ever heard of a raised bog before? If so, I wonder, is there any near your school? Why don't you find out? So a raised bog is one type of bog in Ireland. We have two main types. One is raised and the other one is blanket, and we'll look at both of these today. A raised bog is really created following on from a fen. So once plants begin to decompose at the edge of a lake, and once conditions are right, the lake slowly starts to reduce its size. The fen then continues to grow, and over time, a raised bog habitat, there's the lake, there's the fen, and now we have this hump, this raised bog habitat begins to form. And as water cannot flow up a hill, it can only flow down a hill, the main water supply to this land is rainwater, and that is very low in nutrients. A thing called sphagnum moss, a type of moss, is adapted to grow in low nutrient environments. And it likes acidic conditions also. So this plant just thrives in these kind of fen conditions, and it becomes the main plant. Some people even call this plant the bog builder because of this. And as it lives and grows over time, it makes the bog more and more acidic. There may also be species like cotton grass and cranberry and sundew on the moss hummocks, on those little lumpy bits. This image shows just some of the plants that grow in raised bogs, and this is taken from the Irish Peatland Conservation Council's website, a really fantastic website with lots of information about our bogs and other peatlands. An example of a raised bog in Ireland is Clara Bog in County Offaly in the Midlands. Clara Bog began to form about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, when the lake was filled with a layer of dead vegetation, forming fen peat. This coincided with the time that raised bogs began to form in Ireland. Raised bogs have an average peat depth of 9 to 12 metres, so really, really, really deep. Clara Bog is about 10 metres deep. And a 30 centimetre layer of active living sphagnum moss is on top of all the dead peat underneath. So let's have a look at Clara Bog in a bit more detail.
One of the wetland types Ireland is most famous for is our raised bogs. Clara Bog is a classic example of a midland raised bog. At its centre, the peat can grow to a depth of 10 metres or more. Peat bogs are unique wildlife habitats, slightly acidic and always wet. Sundews catch insects on their sticky tentacles, digesting them from there. This is an insect-eating plant growing all over Ireland's peat bogs. On a healthy peat bog, the surface layer of mosses are always growing, soaking up water as they grow. Without sphagnum moss, there would be no bog. Raised bogs provide breeding habitat for two of Ireland's rarest raptors, the merlin and the short-eared owl, as well as some of our most threatened waders, lapwing, curlew and snipe. The hen harrier is a winter visitor to raised bogs, where it hunts over the open habitats for small mammals and birds. While most of the Midlands raised bogs have been harvested for peat production, Clara Bog is one of the most intact.
We have thick sequences of peat that are fully saturated, mainly from the rainfall. The key to the saturated level of the peat is that the water is at or near the surface most of the time throughout the year. That has the effect of storing carbon. As the plants grow and die over the annual cycle, the carbon that is contained within the plants is retained.
As long as bogs such as this remain wet, the vast quantities of carbon they contain can be stored away for thousands of years to come. But drained peat is a net emitter of greenhouse gases, and that's why peatland rehabilitation and restoration is so crucial now, for their habitats, for climate, for water quality, for life.
Fantastic. So that was a raised bog. Now we're going to look at blanket bogs. Has anyone here ever heard of a blanket bog before? And if so, I wonder, do you know, is there any near your school? Well, outside of the Midlands, most peatlands in Ireland, especially in the west, are described as blanket bogs. They form in areas where the average annual rainfall is greater than 1,200 millimetres per year, and where rain falls on at least 235 out of our 365 days each year. That's a lot of rain. They're very wet areas. So blanket bogs form in quite a different way to the raised bogs that we looked at already. They began to form about 4,000 to 7,000 years ago, so relatively recently. So they're much younger than raised bogs, although they're not really young compared to our age. And they form because of tree clearance in these areas, along with high rainfall. Minerals such as iron were washed down to the lower layers of soil. The minerals accumulated to form an impermeable layer called an iron pan. And this caused waterlogs. It doesn't let water flow through very well. It holds the water in, so the water level just goes higher and higher, and it causes waterlogging. And this waterlogging helps peat to form. The average depth is 1.5 to 3 meters deep, and there are two main types of blanket bog. There's a lowland blanket bog, and there's a mountain blanket bog as well. Blanket bogs spread across the landscape and comprise areas of wet peat with heather and small hedges, purple moorgrass, cotton grass, and bog mosses. An example that we don't have a video for today, but the example that I'm sharing with you today is Easky Bog in Sligo. This site forms the headwaters of the Cowa River and consists of a plateau covered with highland blanket bogs and the steep slopes of the Ox Mountains covered by peatland. The diversity of habitats is high, which means there's lots of different types of habitats in that area. And it's one of the few places in Ireland where lowland and mountain blanket bogs are right beside each other. These bogs are important for regulation of water quality, as we mentioned earlier, and river flow, and they provide a fantastic habitat for the Greenland greater white-fronted goose and the European golden plover. These are examples of some of the vegetation or some of the diversity of plants that we can find on blanket bogs in Ireland. And again, this picture or this infographic is taken from the IPCC website, the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. So the vegetation that you'd find in blanket bogs would be made up of heathers, cotton grass, bog mosses, small sedges. And in some of the lowland blanket bogs, you'd find purple moorgrass and black bog rush. And of course, the sphagnum mosses. So our fourth out of the 5 habitats and wetland examples that we're going to look at today, the fourth one is a turlock. Has anybody ever heard of a turlock before? Well, a turlock is a lake that appears during the wettest time of the year, winter, and it disappears again in spring. Turlocks are found typically in karst limestone landscapes. Now, what on earth is that, I hear you ask? Well, a karst limestone landscape is where underneath the soil, the ground is made up mainly of limestone. And that limestone, because it's a softer rock, it can erode away very easily compared to harder rocks. And you find underground in these regions, you can find lots of examples of caves, and there's fissures and holes and lots of areas where there's gaps in the rock. And this is why it's easy in some ways for water to travel around in those underground chambers and channels. So the name Turlough comes from the Irish words dry lake. And the type of underground water system that causes the Turlough to appear and disappear according to the seasons is nearly unique to Ireland. And because of their unusual environmental conditions, turloughs support very special ecosystems, which are rich in plants and insects. So here's a picture showing what's happening underground. You have this limestone, but it has lots of gaps and channels and pores and tunnels that the water can pass through. In some turloughs, there is a permanent pond or wetland, say right in the middle here at the lowest point throughout the year, but in others there's not. However, in the wintertime, when the water table rises, when there's a lot of rain and there's a lot of water around, the water level gets higher and higher. And so when these higher channels get full, they spill out here into this area, filling it up. They can fill up really quickly over a matter of hours or days through the hollow water-filled galleries in the bedrock that open out into one or more swallow holes. These can be hard to spot when the turlough is dry, and it's not clear where all the swallow holes of any turlough are sometimes. In the summertime, many of these turloughs are grasslands and they're grazed by cattle. So our example today is a turlough found at a place called Lough Cool in Galway. Let's have a look.
Ireland has lots of different types of wetland, from small springs and ponds to massive peat bogs and lakes. One of the more unusual wetland types here is called a turlough. Turloughs are seasonal lakes in a karst limestone landscape. They fill up with groundwater in wintertime and empty out in summer. Here in the Gort lowlands of southwest Galway lies a very large turlough, Lough Cool, also known as Cool Garryland Lough.
The site is part of a larger area which is a special area of conservation, which is to protect the habitats and the animals, and also a special protection area which protects the birds. And apart from that, it's also a Ramsar wetland site. The site is important for birds, including importantly the Hooper swan, which visits us from Iceland every winter. And you have up to 100 of them here in Cool Park, so it's a very special site for those birds. You also get widgeon, curlew, lapwing, and plenty of other water birds too.
The site is a stronghold for pine martens, making a comeback from near extinction in Ireland. Other mammals dependent on the habitats are otters, red squirrels, badgers, stoats and bats. It is the unusual conditions here that make it such a special place.
When the water here subsides in the spring, it reveals a sward of grasses, sedges and wildflowers, including the really rare mudwort with its paddle-shaped leaves. The fen violet, which is very attractive, is very pale mauve flowers.
The rare and sensitive habitats at Cool are fragile. They need to be protected from excess nutrients and other forms of pollution coming in off the wider catchment. Careful management of both the land and the waterways is needed to protect this special place for wildlife, for water quality, for life.
So our final example today of a wetland is an area of transitional waters. Transitional waters means changing waters. So transition means to change. So when we're moving from rivers and streams, which are freshwater, in as those rivers move and flow into the sea, they become less like fresh water, they turn brackish, and then finally they turn into salt water, or they spill into salt water. So those areas where the water is mixed, it can be brackish or salty, depending on how much rain has fallen recently. Those areas are typically known as estuaries and lagoons as well. So The example we're going to look at is the slobs in Wexford. That's a transitional area between freshwater wetland on the land as it flows and meets the sea. So the Wexford slobs are a flat farmland area, and they are walled off from Wexford Harbour and reclaimed from the sea in the 1840s, so a long time ago, nearly 200 years ago, partly as a famine relief project. The Wexford slobs and harbour, by their very nature, are really attractive to wildfowl and waders, so different types of birds, and are internationally famous for wintering flocks of certain species of geese and ducks and godwits, amongst others. A prominent Wexford family called the Redmonds started the project in the 1840s. And they took up the idea of reclaiming land on the north side of the harbour. The operations began in 1847, and this was during the worst year of the Great Potato Famine. And so they tried to provide employment for the labourers, and so they asked folk to come out and build this wall. The artificial bank on the north slope was built as a continuation from the natural bank, and clay was brought from the nearby heights and from one of the small islands to help with the construction. The banks were 8 feet or 2.5 meters wide at the top, and enclosed over here more than 2,400 acres. And by 1849, the North Slope project had been finished and completed. And this big wall along here stopped the sea on the left of the picture from flowing in onto the land that you can see on the right-hand side of the picture. And that meant that that land would dry out and could now be farmed. And that was the whole purpose of it, of course. The area was drained by canals, and drains and pumps were also built to pump out the water that had been caught behind the wall. So for about 100 years, much of the slob lands provided rough summer grazing for livestock, and parts have been cultivated for cereals and root crops. And since the 1960s, drainage has been improved and farming has now intensified. Nowadays, most of the lands are sown with high-quality grasses and winter and spring cereals. So over 250 bird species have been recorded on the reserve, many of them winter migrants from Greenland and Arctic Canada and from Scandinavia and Arctic Russia. Greenland white-fronted geese are the most numerous and important goose species on the reserve, and it is for them initially that the reserve was established. They breed on the western lowlands of Greenland during the summer and winter in Ireland, and they come to winter in Ireland and Scotland from October time to March. So the northern slob holds about 8,500 or 45% of the total global population of Greenland white-fronted geese during these months. That's incredible. It's nearly half of the whole population of Greenland white-fronted geese spend their time in those fields on the North Slope. The birds and wildlife on the reserve can be watched from the 8-metre tall observation tower and 3 other hides around the site. The reserve itself was established in 1974, so it's coming up to its 50th anniversary next year, nearly, and it is now about 550 acres in size.
Ireland is well known for its coastal wetlands and for the many migratory birds who spend each winter here. Wexford Wildfowl Reserve is a wonderful wetland habitat. It's an unusual nature reserve in that it's a man-made wetland, reclaimed from the sea by a long polder. Since it was formed, it has become an incredibly important site for wintering birds. Half of the world's population of Greenland white-fronted geese come here each winter. Canadian Brent geese arrive in their thousands each autumn, having flown all the way from Arctic Canada to spend the winter months here. Whooper swans arrive from Iceland. Barnacle geese come here from Greenland. Special crops are grown to make sure that the geese have enough to sustain them through the winter months.
We work in partnership with about a dozen farmers on the place who all own land on the North Slob. They look after the slob for us and produce crops on their own behalf and also for the geese.
The diversity of habitat types in the area is something special, providing for the needs of these wild birds and other wildlife too.
What is brilliant for the public here is that you have a wetland centre. You could go up into the tower and you can look down and you see this magic of hundreds of birds of different species feeding together.
The place is also important because it has a safe roosting place. Every evening at about sundown and afterwards, all the geese fly out into Wexford Harbour and they roost off the Raven Point and spend the night there on the sandbars.
Places like Wexford Wildfowl Reserve and Raven Point are crucial sites for wildlife. It's up to us to make sure that they will still be here for future generations to enjoy.
For further information and maybe to book a visit, you can visit the Wexford Wildfowl Reserve.ie website. For more information on the different wetlands that we've looked at today, you can visit irishwetlands.ie. And there's great information as well on the ipcc.ie website, the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, where they have even lesson plans and resources available to use in schools, looking at our various bogs and some of our other peatlands around the country. And of course, greenschoolsireland.org website has lots of resources on the topic of biodiversity in general. And keep an eye out there for upcoming events as we go through the year.